coders globally, and what challenges does Andela face?
Right. So Andela pretty much functions by building technology leaders and technologists in Africa that build their expertise and skill by working in real-world environments with software companies around the globe. Now, we've been doing this for 2 years. So far, we've had 216 developers go through that program. One of our goals is to get to 100,000. And at first, we started with training, and we built curriculum, we built programs to support our developers in building these skills so they could deliver value for their partners around the world. But we realized that if we really want to get to 100,000, we need to change the way we think about training. We need to change the way we think about education. And we've since made the shift from training to learning. And the opportunity that I see there is creating an environment where we're harnessing blended learning with our curriculum and also some of the methods of Ecole 42 by transferring the ownership of learning to the individual, as opposed to having an instructor or a trainer showing them what to do, give them the opportunity to explore and to create and have that be the means for their own learning.
Let me ask now NOMVUYO to share with us some of her insights with her work on digital and education.
Right, so I live in two different worlds. I'm an informal educator, and in informal education, I create content for children's television, radio, apps, all of that. And then in the formal education sphere, I establish secondary schools across the African continent. And so I think I'll try and answer as quickly as I can that answer for both spheres. With children's television in particular, I think there are incredible unique opportunities there, and radio, because radio and television remain the largest classrooms in the world. And the technological space has not quite come to meet our needs within that space. One of the big problems we have, for example, in app development is the fact that people think that just because they've created an app that is for children, then somehow it's automatically educational. And so the quality assurance and quality control is a huge problem for us. And we feel oftentimes we're the dumping ground for innovations which we love. We like the idea of being able to create new things, but the challenge for us is that we can't just take it just because it's been created. And oftentimes that's the challenge that we're in. The other is the assumption that we want to, as educators, we want to only be consumers. So we love notions of laptops in the classroom, but it often means that we get the laptop, but there's the assumption that we're not interested in what's behind the laptop. There's an assumption that we're not interested in the engineering, that we're not interested in the technical journey to that. And by we, I mean both teachers and students. I would love a time where it's understood that some of those laptops should actually be broken laptops so that we can open them up and play with them. I'm eager to work with people who understand early childhood education and the fact that there's so much more investment of time and resources that needs to go into that, because what occurs in the first 3 years is something that can last a lifetime. So for me, there's some wonderful opportunities there, and those are some of the challenges very briefly. As a formal educator in the secondary school space, our goal at Ecole Education is to have 40 schools in 20 countries over the next 5 years. We currently have 6 in 5 countries, and we started 2 years ago. And the challenge, the opportunity is immense. We can connect these children. The goal is for us to take them to schools all around the world, high quality universities. And already our first cohort has gone on to universities, most of them choosing to do pre-med. And we utilize technology both in terms of a curriculum in the classroom, but also for back-end systems. As many of you know, the challenges in working between countries on the African continent can be quite a challenge. It's not just about language. It's also that the bureaucracies and the rules and the regulations about things like school establishment, like graduation rates, like children's ability to travel, even between countries, it's immense. I mean, even something as simple as a field trip from Mozambique to South Africa takes a staff member 3-4 months full-time just to arrange for a group of 20 students. So for us, those are difficulties. Oftentimes we're able to solve them with technology, but we find that on this continent, it still matters to have human interactions.
Very nice. I have just a few more questions for the panel, and then I'm going to ask all of you to jump in also with your questions. But let me first take a show of hands. How many of you are in the education sector? You are educationists, or you're doing e-learning, technology for learning? Okay, good. So we have quite a few that we can address. My next question would be, we'll begin with you, how would you define success for each of your initiatives, maybe in the near term and in the long term? So you mentioned, for example, being able to arrange visits between schools is a good success metric, but you also mentioned bigger ones about curriculum and schools in 20 countries and so on. So what is success in the learning system? How can digital transform it in what ways?
Mm-hmm. Well, with anchor education and the secondary schools that we're establishing, success defined within the digital sphere would obviously be automatically that we are having more learners graduate from us who are interested in technological careers. So that would be fantastic. It would show that what we are exposing them to in the school system is easily being transferred to their career choices. It also means, even if that's not the case, that they are not just digital natives, but they've become experts. So the notion of creating technological worlds is not for them about later, but about now. We would love for us to have, some of the top 40 digital individuals who get invited to conferences like this to actually one day be secondary school students. So for us, those are some of the things that we're looking towards. In my other sphere, in informal education, in the multimedia world, is that if there was an understanding about the fact that the ability to become a digital native begins with what you know and can do in early childhood. So for me, success would be where we understand and we create things specifically for that age range, specifically for those teachers who work in that sphere, who are often the most undereducated on this continent. The primary and secondary school teachers have far more credentials across Africa, no exception. There's no country that's an exception than our early childhood. And yet what we actually need is the reverse. We need for them to be much more advanced. So success there would be, there's a lot of things that that early childhood child can consume across multiple platforms that are created for them for their age appropriateness, for their developmental appropriateness, but also with cultural sensitivity and nuance. So you don't just create one thing and think that just because I'm in Cameroon and I'm in South Africa and I'm in Lesotho, I'll automatically understand it. You've created those, those cultural nuances to make it work. And also a cost. Whether it's you're talking about internet and data costs, but also cost in terms of human resources. We find oftentimes that we've spent so many years and time investing in educators or investing in technical expertise, and we lose them to the West. I wouldn't mind if we're losing them to African countries, but we happen to be losing them, to the West. So I feel for me that would be a win sometime pretty soon.
Very nice. Nadayar, what's success for Andela beyond, the numbers are very impressive, but beyond the numbers, what are you looking at?
Right. A lot of our success is going to be measured by the amount of impact that we have. So earlier, I mentioned that we've had 216 developers go through our program, and sometimes it's surprising to discover that in that 216, there are only about 18% female in Nigeria and about 26% female in Kenya. So one of the initiatives that we're working on is building that interest for women in technology, because if we're going to be the future technology leaders and build solutions to our local problems, we need to make sure that the technologies building those technologies are diverse enough to understand the problems from different users' perspectives. So one thing that we're measuring is how diverse we can be. For now, is mostly gender focused, and the other thing is we've built these curriculums and these programs, and we're making it work for hundreds of people. But all of these is still within Andela. If we want to have the amount of impact that we want to have across all of Africa, we need to figure out a way to make it work so that the rest of Africa can participate and benefit from our methods and our research. So there are talks right now about exploring different ways of building learning communities. There are talks about exploring how to build virtual learning environments using virtual reality. For now, we're not sure the exact strategy we want to follow, but one huge measure of success would be how we expose our methods to the rest of Africa so we can all participate.
Gavin, you've got some impressive targets you've set for yourself. 20 million livelihoods in Africa within the next 20 years. Any, what kinds of livelihoods perhaps, and any age groups you're looking at maybe?
Well, of course, yeah. From lots of people I've spoken to here who are doing similar interventions like this, you know, you start off with a hypothesis, you see some success with a couple of hundred people, which is where we are with our deep impact program, and then through your own, you know, as Nadayar was just saying, your own desire to share this with a larger number of people, and also because your funders are saying, okay, you've done this for a couple of hundred people, now how do we reach 1 million, which is what Google said to us. And so you start to think, how can you cascade this in a reasonable way? But for us, there's a tension there because success for us is livelihoods, and that's how we define it, and that's how why we've set ourselves a big 20-year ambition, because we want to be a force that makes an impact on the creation of livelihoods at scale. And for us, a livelihood is not just earning money, it's also being able to participate in a democracy. It's about having a voice as well. So that's why my company also does work around advocacy and creating media platforms for young people as well. But I think that question of impact is really key. I mean, over the last, I'll be very honest, over the last 14 months we trained 70,000 people, which sounds really impressive, but I wonder about what the impact of that actually is, you know, and that's driven by, again, our ambition to spread this work, and the pressure, you know, the pressure and the word scale that every funder and every partner will throw at you. But what is true scale? You know, is it about training 1 million, or is it about, as Nadayar was saying, spreading a methodology, creating a methodology that can be shared and taken on by other people? So my hunch is, for the work we're doing anyway, the power is in the network of people that we're developing rather than in the content, the curriculum, or anything else.
KWAME, I think you can join the discussion now.
Yes. I share a lot of things, especially with Andela. I'm completely right if you're talking about short-term vision or this kind of things. It's really about you need when you are talking about innovation, we need to have different people, as I said previously. One of the biggest challenge is about women in technical fields, which is a big challenge in Europe for most part of it. Not so much in Asia, where you can find a lot of girls who are coding in IT school and computer science program. It starts to drop down too, but it's something very important for 3 reasons. The first reason is the quality of your innovation. As you said, if you don't have women who are coding, you won't be able to create specific things for women. Like, let's talk about, for example, pregnancy. You can't ask me to write a software about pregnancy because, like, I don't care. It's not about my field. Okay, so you need women to code this kind of app software. And you have plenty of them where you can find innovation will be around women, and they're going to start to create, to think different. And by thinking different, they're going to create things different. So that's the first challenge. The second is, as everyone say over here, people are asking us, can you provide more developers, more programmers? I can say yes, but at the beginning, we are working with half of the population. So if you want to double the number of programmers at 42, you just have to add women, and then you double it. like that, okay? So that's it. But the most important thing is the social impact. Who is going to rule the world in 15, 20 years? 20 years ago, you could ask to any student who he knows as the big chief of a big company. He's going to give you the name of guys from General Electric, from Airbus, from Boeing, from industrial companies. Now, you ask the same thing to a teenager. He's going to tell you, Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs, this kind of guys in the field of digital. So who's going to, why Mark Zuckerberg, why Tom Cook, why always men? Because all of them, they come from the IT field. And in the IT field, on the computer science, you have 90% of boy. So of course, the next leader of the world is going to be boy. And who is going to be on the border of the highway? Who can take the train? People who don't understand how the technology was working. So if you don't, if girls say don't learn, I would like to say code, but it's not exactly what I would like to say, but how do we have this literacy about digital? They will be on the border of the highway, on the train of digital, going cross like that. And it's not something we want to do. And after, for a long term, I'm just talking about the social impact, for example, on that time. But on the long term, it's the most important. We do education. When you do education, you have a big responsibility because someone's going to follow your courses, your curriculum. Or maybe in his life, he's going to follow 1, 2, 3 of your higher education curriculum for 42, for example. But no more than 2 or 3. So you count as someone very important of what is going to be tomorrow. So if you want to know if 42 is working, you know maybe 10 years after the first alumni are out of 42, do we have like people who have managed to transform their dream in reality, who transform their dream in nightmare, okay? And I vote for the first answer.
VUYISILE, what are some success metrics for you beyond how many girls, how many schools, but I'm sure you're looking at the quality of the impact as well.
Yeah, so I think it's funny that Gavin mentioned that number of 1 million, right? So just like NOMVUYO, Black Girls Code, we're focused on girls primarily, you know, in that secondary school age. So we said, let's say 7 and 17. And so, you know, you're dealing with young girls. And like we have this number, like especially in the US, like we're under 1 million more black women, African American in their specific context, women in programming. But the funny thing is like, cool, that's this number that's out there. But actually, the most important thing is like, if we were successful, we wouldn't be having this discussion that we're having about gender and technology in the same way. Ideal success is that there doesn't need to be a Black Girls Code because black girls are coding, such that there's no specific organization doing that work, right? So when you start dealing with that, then it actually starts saying, okay, we had this big number, we start realizing, oh, there's an issue around who has access, and in the big picture, we actually don't want this to be an issue. But when we started saying, okay, here's our big vision, let's look at tactically smaller goals. And you said, okay, look, in terms of the school, we want, when we create homework, one of our very simple metrics was that everybody hands in their homework. And not everyone has access to a computer, so we made sort of homework on paper, and we were doing website development, for example. We should make your website on your HTML and your CSS on paper, and then when you come into your next class, as part of your recap, we bring that up on the screen, because kids don't have access. But then as we started making these small metrics and focusing, we started realizing there's stuff that's really important, but we can't really effectively measure. And one of the things is that there's very specific challenges around gender in the African context, I imagine the global context, around when you speak to some of these girls, like one of the girls, like personal issues around, there's a teacher who wants to date me, what should I do? There's issues around, oh, this is not seen specifically as something that young women should be doing in terms of technology. So then we started saying, okay, how do we, as part of this, one of the things that we want is that we have young women who are proud of the ability that they can create something in technology and are excited about creating something in technology and will keep working towards that. So that's very hard to measure, but we do measure it around, we have short retros. At the end, we call it like a retrospective, and we get feedback after like a session, like a specific amount of sessions, where we say, oh, you know, how much is the homework enough, or is it too little or too much? And then we've been overwhelmingly getting, oh, we want more homework. We really enjoyed the work. Let's do more of that. And yes, homework sounds like a very old school thing, but it's sort of like we evaluate when you leave and you don't have access to a computer, how do you do something to engage with technology, right? And then there's also metrics around, you know, if we had lessons or we've had sessions, would they be shorter or longer? And they want longer sessions, and they want more sessions, and they want to bring their friends to the sessions. So we like, in certain ways, we try to evaluate, just for us at least, it's sort of like we're at the point where we just want to know that they are engaged, they're creative, they want to keep doing it. And we find ways of trying to measure that as a short-term thing. And then longer term, it's sort of like, oh, if you are engaged, you're creative, you love doing this, you are start implementing this in other parts of your life, then hopefully more of those girls will into the STEM field, etc. And then hopefully or the other thing we also do is we tend to get a lot of our volunteers are female, so female programmers, and we get females to come speak about their journey in technology. So they say, oh, hey, I came from this background. Some have come from very underprivileged backgrounds, some from more privileged backgrounds. Some became developers, some became business analysts. There's a Mrs. South Africa who used to be a developer. And we're trying to expose these young women to different women in the technology sector to say, hey, these people come from similar backgrounds or not so similar backgrounds, but you can do this because they can do this. So there's a lot of social change that has to happen, very specific cultural context that is very hard to deal with and is very hard to measure, but we're trying to also deal with that. So I guess success, creative, empowered young women who are part of the technology sector, whether that's full-time working, whether that's studying, whether that's becoming an accountant and having a say in the IT and policy of their company.
Okay. Getting students to like homework and bring their friends to school, that is certainly very noble as a goal. For the last two questions, we're going to look now a bit towards the future. What are some emerging trends and what needs to be done to accelerate EdTech even more? So I'll begin again with the VUYISILE. Can you share with the audience what do you see as some of the emerging technology trends, maybe business model trends that our audience needs to look at? It's going to be 2017 very soon, and a lot of crystal ball gazing, all that sort of happens. So this is the first time you're going to hear about trends for 2017 and beyond. So VUYISILE, why don't you start?
Yeah, you know, I feel a bit on the spot. I mean, I've never really been so much into trends in the sense of, I think it's generally in any of these sectors, like we'll speak about the next up and coming trends, but these are things that are generally have been happening, and now we think on the verge of, you know, having a wider success, or at least the mainstream is willing to pay attention. In terms of some of the trends, I think the combination of, and especially for Black Girls Code, it's a combination of like having some sort of curriculum or something along with that blended personalized learning, along with volunteer interaction, at least in our case, is really important. So I think it's not so much, oh, MOOC is the one way. It's not so much no educators is the one way. I think there's how do you effectively balance that? How do you effectively have blended learning such that somebody has support and interaction when they need it? There's also a computer to focus on what they do. So really for me, it's sort of like, how do you take those people who are, instead of like, as you know, at 42, it's sort of like, oh, we don't want this traditional model, which makes sense of, oh, have your lecture at you and then do the next thing. But as they're saying, how do you have challenges where they, you know, it's sort of, how do you work in groups and have challenges and figure that out, but then you have somebody to facilitate and talk to. Because sometimes the challenges that you have are not just, and especially in our context, the challenges that people have are not just about the technology, but the social and contextual challenges that sometimes you need human-to-human interaction and support for. And at the same time, there's technology there to teach you the basics and then someone to ask questions. And ideally you work with, I think the other bit is working with your peers. So the other thing about Black Girls Code is we always work in pairs. At ThoughtWorks as a agile development company, pairing is really important. So again, how do you work together in pairs and how do you have support when you need it, but when you don't, you can figure out the next thing.
KWAME, what are some trends that you have your eye on?
I think the trends for tomorrow is to how technically to resolve the big issue on the impact we want. So one of the two biggest one are the price of education that we must drop down drastically. Like it's impossible to have an education. Just for your information, in France, for example, the price for a student in any engineering school is more than $13,000 to $15,000 by students. Okay, so it's something impossible for Africa to afford. So we have to drop down to 100. Okay, so how we going to do that? On the second one is the challenge of the scaling. So how to have an impact? We are talking about 100,000, a million, people that must be reached by this education, billion of them, how you do that. To address those two issues, I think one of the big things that's going to be, I would like to say trendy, but very efficient, is what we call peer-to-peer learning, which mainly means that students are going to learn among themselves. So actually, in a good in a standard system of education, like in France, you have a ratio of 1 teacher for 15 students. So of course, if you are talking about education of 1 billion students, you are talking about having like 15 million teacher, which is impossible to get because you need 15 years to get 1 teacher. So it's like you have it's a huge pyramid and you don't know how to tend that. But as soon as you use peer-to-peer, students are going to learn among themselves. Okay, you can deploy a lot of education. Okay, so for example, at 42, we use these kind of things. So we are a staff of less than 20 people, and we deliver very high-level education in computer programming because this is the scope of the school, to more than, we're going to be in 5 years around 10,000 students, okay? With just, I would like to say 20 members of the staff, okay? You can go much more than 10,000 with this kind of education. It's just that for 42 we are focused on very high-end, on very high level of computer programming, so it's a bit different. So, but through that, of course, because we have just only 20, the price of education by student dropped down drastically, like we divided by 10, okay, from the price we have in France, for example, by students. And of course, we have 10,000 students in the school in 3 years, which never happened in the West, in a West country since maybe 200 years, I don't know, something like that, okay?
Gavin, you mentioned the rise of the freelance economy as one trend. What are some other trends you're seeing in digital livelihood?
Well, we're waiting for that one. And I think some of the trends are things we're hoping for. So, you know, there was a lot of investment last year put in by the Rockefeller Foundation into the kind of hypothesis that if you could teach young people to join the freelance economy in Africa, then they could undercut people in Europe and the US and make a good living, but it didn't work. Maybe it will work in the future. It sounds like it should work, but I think I would definitely, you know, endorse the thing about peer-to-peer. That really resonates with us because that's a way of cascading learning, and with young people as the experts, and they're leading the knowledge transfer. We've seen that working very effectively. And the blended solution I'd also really back up because, you know, it's really encouraging to see how young people in Africa can and will learn on their own with a device. And, you know, there's clearly something there that everyone's striving for that would be the ultimate scale, you know, the computer in a box, the classroom in a box type idea. But I don't see that, you know, coming to fruition anytime soon. There's just too many barriers at the moment, from infrastructure to, you know, the level of basic education to, and then on the demand side, you know, a whole re-education that's needed of employers and HR departments of how they recruit and what they look for. So trends, I think, can be a little bit of a misleading thing to focus on, because I think, as Buntle said earlier, it's a long-term game, I think. And I think we're all sort of in our own way seeking some kind of complete revolution in the way that education is done. But as Juliana was saying yesterday, perhaps that revolution will happen in incremental stages.
Nadayar.
Thank you. So permit me to drop a little bit of learning science here. So back at Andela, we have a vice president of learning. His name is Adam Lupu. He's 35 years learning science experience. And we have what we call the Lupu learning laws. And one of them says that we have 3 modes of learning. The first one is cognition, so what you're thinking about the things that you're studying, and The second one is construction, what you're building with your hands that enable you to master what you're learning. And the third one is community, who you're interacting with while learning. So the trends that I see are more around the community. Right now, there's a lot of educational innovation around mobile, because there's lots of internet penetration using mobile in Africa. And the question we have to answer is, how do we leverage mobile technology to build effective learning communities? And like I also hinted at earlier, there's also the possibility of building virtual learning communities using virtual reality. Now, I do not suspect that that's going to be very cost effective. So for now, one trend that I see coming up is the use of mobile technology to build effective learning communities.
So in the secondary school world and schools in general, I think one of the trends that we're going to see is more and more entrepreneurs creating educational institutions that are not just for their communities, but they're understanding that the sustainability of it also comes from being able to create more branches across the country that they're in, and perhaps going across the border. So we're seeing already we're seeing more really interesting kinds of schools being established, and I think with the right kind of support and recognition, those institutions will continue to grow, but grow meaningfully. So in education, it can't just be about numbers. It also has to be about depth. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Certainly from an Ecole education perspective, a trend I would certainly like to see is more partnerships with innovators like the ones that are in this conference, because I think we have more of an appetite. Ecole education has more of an appetite to be a model, to be a laboratory for some of the things that are being created, where people want to test whether is this going to work amongst a certain age group. So even though that's not necessarily a trend, it's certainly something I'd like to be able to see. With multimedia, I think one of the things that we will see more of, certainly in the South African context, is made for digital kinds of edutainment. So the idea that you can produce a television show, and it's not necessarily for the television set, because fewer and fewer people are watching television on TV sets. And that is as true for adults as it is for young children. So the 4 or 5 or 6-year-old is engaging in edutainment on their mom or their big sister or big brother's mobile device. And those devices do not have quality content on them. So certainly one would hope that there'll be more of that, more and more of that that's seen in the future. The other thing that's going to trend, and this is very much a South Africa example, is what's assisting us very much in the university movement that's occurring in South Africa is going to be the awareness that there's got to be a fundamental change philosophically and culturally and socio-politically to how we teach across the board, not just at universities. So we're definitely going to see pre-collegiate institutions take notice of that and review and relook the curriculum. In other African countries, they are there somewhat, but in many, the colonial legacies are so immensely strong and entrenched, and it's really important to overcome those. It's impossible for me to close without just coming back to the gender issues. And I think the way in which VUYISILE's Black Girls Code is doing it is actually quite right. The notion of differentiating the educational experiences so that you have a girls-only kind of program is really important, and the research supports that. It supports that if you have a gender-based, technical, scientific kinds of programming, girls do much better in those settings, particularly at the adolescence age. At other ages, it doesn't matter, but at that particular age, the differences it's really important. And I'm sure this is not what KWAME meant, but I would hope that the inclusion of women is for more than programs that attend to pregnancy.
Okay, I'm sure he does. Okay, I have one last question for the panel, and then I'm going to ask all of you to jump in with your questions. I can see many of you on your laptops. I hope what you're doing is tweeting some of the remarks from these speakers. And my last question for you will pick up on what was said in the morning session, which is, how should we engage with government and industry to accelerate the fruits of EdTech? So let's begin with you. Some of your thoughts on maybe two recommendations, maybe 2 lines each, and then let's move on.
I
From
think
your experience, what has worked?
well,
You know,
for me, with government, is that I wish they would recognize early childhood. I wish governments everywhere on this continent would make it part of the formal educational system, make it compulsory from the time you are 2 years old. You are forced to go into an educational institution of some sort, even if it's the home-based care, where the person who's looking after you has the competencies and capabilities to enrich your experiences. So that's a hope and a wish. And then the other one would just be the transparencies and interactions between governments, so that those of us who are moving between countries, that's already facilitated, and we don't have to learn from scratch, we don't have to suffer and bleed from scratch every single time we enter a country. And that's exactly what's happening right now.
what are your 2 one-line recommendations?
Thank you, because I don't have more to say than one line. So what I would suggest to the government is for them to leverage the use of technology more in their daily operations, because that would then force them to acknowledge the shortage of technology talent in our society. And maybe when they see that gap and acknowledge it, they'll be more willing to invest in the education that can support the building of that talent.
Gavin, how are you working with government, and what would you
Well,
like to
I
say?
have a lot to thank the South African government for, because I'm a Brexit refugee, and they granted me asylum 5 years ago. And but actually, I've never worked with government in South Africa, and I was actually advised by someone quite senior in government to ignore government and just get on with it.
A contrarian viewpoint, yes, KWAME?
In fact, it's quite easy. If there is a trouble with education in Africa, it's due to government. Okay? It's because they are the governors. On here, we are 5 of us. On the 5 of us, we are a non-governmental organization. So actually, everyone here thinks that the government is so no efficient to manage education in their own country, okay, that we have created a non-governmental organization. So it's quite easy. You have nothing to ask to a government, okay? They don't know how to manage education, so that's it, okay? So if you have a country with 40% of analphabet, there is a reason, okay? And the reason is easy, because the government, so there is no advice to give them, okay? Nothing to do, it's dead.
So I guess, you know, I think in my way I disagree a bit with that statement, insofar as I mean, I can definitely see where that statement comes from, especially frustration with the government. And so I think I'll say, like, so in Black Girls Code, right, what we have is it is privately sponsored, non-governmental. We've got laptops, and then you find a curriculum online, and then the kids are working together, and then somebody facilitates that, right? But for us, it was sort of like not engagement with government is not a case of, like, you know, we just don't think government is useful at all, and they can be a challenge. But I think any bureaucracy, not just government, you've seen it happen with corporates, are bad or are not so great at fast, rapid change and innovation. So I think that for us, it was sort of like, you know, we're doing this because we're going to pilot this, we're going to figure this out. Like, as a government, you have to have some level of rules and regulations, so you can't just pilot and test anything. So we are saying, as organizations working in the space, pilot stuff, test stuff, figure it out, and when you're at a point of maturity, then you engage with government, right? So you sort of understand how you are at a point where now we've got systems in place, now government can support us. And we're at a scale where we need government support. When you're at a small level, you don't necessarily need support from government. On the flip side, I think as an organization, as a volunteer organization, right, when we engage with government, when you're a volunteer organization, you're going to have a lot of turnover. People are going to come in, people are going to go out. And part of that is, like, you start saying, oh, actually, you know, we want to find easy and fast ways to do stuff, right? And so part of that then from the government side of things is not actually say, hey, we know we're not great at this, we know you're not good at innovation, we know you guys are going to figure things out, but we'll put the stuff to support you figuring it out, and when you do get to a point where you scale, we can assist you. So as an example, you know, what we're trying to do with Black Girls Code, as we learn things, I think just like Andela, it's sort of we've learned a few things. We want to codify that and share that with other people, all sorts of people in the sector, so that they can scale up quickly. But then, for example, government could do that around when we are trying to register an MPC to do this, right? That's a very difficult process. When we then say, okay, we do want to engage with the Department of Education because we have a specific pilot or plan for this, now that's a very long, laborious, talking to lots of people process. And the space that government should be in is say, okay, look, we're not going to be the ones to deliver and figure this out, but we're going to come in and join with you and support you in figuring this out. We're going to support the infrastructure that you need to figure that out. And so we're trying to have something in South Africa next year where we get people in the community together, and then we get government and say, look, it is your responsibility to come and support this and support the conversation and listen and figure out how you can facilitate the bigger interaction with these organizations.
All right, we have about 10 or 15 minutes left. I want to ask the audience now to jump in with their questions, comments, suggestions. Yes, we have one. Okay, I'll take you first, and then I'll come across to you.
French chapter. Two major issues are totally absent of what I hear this morning and also yesterday. Why? I just know these two absences: privacy and copyright. And I would like to know why is totally absent. Is because you think that you are only on public domain when you create contents, or and about privacy, how do you think it's a North issue, or why it's totally absent? I want to know your answers.
Anyone addressing issues of ownership of code and maybe curriculum, things of that sort?
I think so. I'll just touch on specifically for us, right, around the copyright issue. So we specifically work with open source tools and programs and toolkits. And the stuff that we do, we then say we are going to open source that. So you have a responsibility, obviously, if you're working with open source tools, to make sure that whatever you create, you're not going to try copyright. So in our specific case, especially as a volunteer organization, we are leveraging, standing on the shoulders of giants, essentially. And for that, we are using open source tools. We can't afford to, even we are sponsored by ThoughtWorks, we can't afford to be buying expensive systems and stuff like that. So all of the stuff, there's a thing called Free Code Camp, and we're using that. And if we do anything where we remix that or add languages, we'll then open source that again.
Yes, during my keynote, I just give you like the philosophy about it. I said to you previously that the idea about the knowledge economy is when I give something to someone, I don't lose my part. Okay, it's what I said previously. It means that it's a sharing, but each time I share a part of the pizza box, I don't lose my part. So of course, yes, it's completely open because it's knowledge. So we give knowledge to people, and everyone who wants the knowledge, he can get it. So for example, if you take specifically 42, we have official chapters in Paris in United States, but in fact, we just opened a chapter in South Africa. We have one in Ukraine, one in Romania. We do that in partnership with people, and we deliver them the knowledge on the technical for education, technologies, on everything, and deliver to them. Of course, it's a complete sharing. It's not a question for us about privacy on this kind of thing. No, there is no privacy. This is knowledge. It is for everyone. So we are completely open about that.
I think that's a really good question. In South Africa, we have something called POPI, Privacy of Protection and Information Act, and it is a pretty well written together document and law. And it's one of the things that you actually benefit from government intervention about. And for us with Ecole education schools, for example, the way we utilize it or abide by it is how we deal with information about children, because we track children performance throughout the school years, so that's 5-6 years. So it's very, very clear about how we can use that information and for what purposes. Same thing with our marketing initiatives and what people are allowed to decline, things that they receive from us, and should we misuse misuse that, well, we can be reported. So I think the policy environment in South Africa is a little bit different than other countries in that there is a note to take care of consumers. But on the other points, I agree with what everybody else said, and which is why I love the technological sphere as an educator, because like us, the notion is please take it, please share, please let's do it together. And that's what I love about technology and what I love about education.
Okay, yeah, one more comment from you, and then let's take a question from here.
I just want to add, like, if I think a final point around the privacy thing specifically, and I mean, from all the organizations, I think the privacy thing in technology comes around a business model where essentially you're selling these students or you're selling your consumers to advertisers. And I think in the organizations, no one is selling a student directly to advertisers. They might be training a student and then working to get them employed. But I think the privacy thing for me really is like generally, at least with us again, because we work with young people, we're not sharing any of those details to anyone. So I think that privacy specific to technology is more of a challenge around when your business model relies on you essentially selling your consumers or people who are interacting with stuff as a product to somebody else. And that's generally with advertising.